Great. Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I am here with Navindu Katugampola from Morgan Stanley, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce the event. We are in a time of great activity with respect to climate change right now. Financial institutions and regulators, including the Fed in the United States, the European Central Bank, the European Stability Mechanism, and others, are actively considering their role in solving global crises like climate change, as well as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Likewise, private financial institutions like banks, asset management firms, insurance firms, and others in the financial sphere are taking active steps to promote a transition to a low carbon economy and to attempt to reduce climate risk. This afternoon, I have the pleasure of engaging in conversation with Navindu, who is the Managing Director of Morgan Stanley Investment Management, to discuss the role of the financial sector in addressing these crises. As well as asking the question of what more firms and governments can do to promote a smooth transition to a zero carbon economy going forward. We also will be discussing what lessons these institutions may have learned in responding to the COVID pandemic that may lead to insights as to how best to address climate change. So for those of you who do not know me, I actually see a few former students in the audience, so that's very nice. I'm an associate professor of legal studies and business ethics at the Wharton School. I'm also one of the 2 faculty leads for the Business, Climate, and Environment Lab of the Wharton Risk Center, which is sponsoring this event. I just want to take a moment to introduce Navindu. Navindu Katugampola is currently the Managing Director at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. In his previous role as Head of Green and Sustainability Bonds, as well as Head of Sovereign and Supranational Agency Origination, Navindu helped to put together a number of groundbreaking deals, including a $1 billion green bond, which was then the biggest of its kind for the World Bank Group's International Finance Corporation. He also spearheaded a €7 billion deal for the Republic of France, which was the largest single issuance of green bonds at the time. I would like to note that we had originally invited another panelist, Colleen Anaviance from the European Stability Mechanism. However, Colleen unfortunately had an emergency and is not able to participate in this evening's conversation. So instead, we are shifting the format to more of a fireside chat, if that is possible over Zoom, between myself and Navindu. So just to explain the format, first, I'm going to ask Navindu some questions for a kind of discussion segment of the evening, and then we will have a moderated Q&A. So if you are in the audience and wish to ask a question, please send me a message in the chat, and then I will go through the chat and ask questions of our speaker. So, so with that introduction, let me turn it over and give Navindu the opportunity to tell us a little bit. So how did you come to focus on the field of sustainable finance? Could you tell us a little bit about your path?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I hope we can make it interesting and engaging for you as well, and hopefully you'll get a little bit of insight in what we're doing at the moment in finance to try and help promote a sustainability agenda. But to take your question from the start, Sarah, in terms of where how I got going in this space. So essentially, I'd studied natural sciences at Cambridge University. I'd specialized in zoology and ecology. So thinking about sustainability was very much at the forefront of my mind, but not in the financial context. I was at that time also interested in finance, and that was the direction I wanted to take my career. I noticed a gap. There was a gap between something like ecology that I was passionate about and finance that wasn't really engaging. This is going back now 20 years or so. That wasn't really engaging with essentially trying to deliver financial solutions to ecological problems. So I thought that could be interesting to explore. there wasn't any obvious route to it, but certainly I thought in the first instance, I wanted to get a financial grounding, so join Morgan Stanley on the graduate program, and managed to work my way through the organization to a role that was, you mentioned the World Bank and their private sector on the IFC, and essentially those institutions became my clients. So working with multilateral development banks like the World Bank, European Investment Bank, and also public sector agencies who were essentially the interface between sustainability and finance for a very long time. And then working with that client base to try and promote their sustainability agenda. And green bonds are one aspect of this, looking at essentially crowding in the private sector now, institutional investors, private sector capital to promote a public sector agenda. And then as that gained traction and took off, we then started looking at ways in which institutional capital could then help promote a private sector sustainability agenda as well, and then started to grow that practice in the banking arm of Morgan Stanley. And more recently, as you mentioned, I've moved across to our investment management division, and this is now thinking about working with asset owners to really catalyze a change in which asset owners allocate capital. And ultimately, it's how capital is allocated that ultimately drives transition, and we want more capital to be moving in a sustainable direction. And that's sort of the key aspect of what I focus on at the moment. So that's sort of a long-winded tour of my career. It started in where you are now, Sarah, in academia, but then looked at the confluence between my academic background and finance, and seeing how I could promote both of them through my career.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's really helpful. I know that there are going to be many people in the audience who are still in university, still in college, and beginning to think about their own careers. And I think it's really interesting to hear your path. So let's get down to sort of why this is important in the financial sector at all. Recently, in the past year, all 6 of the largest banks in the United States have committed to aligning themselves with the principles of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And they have basically made commitments publicly that they will become net zero emissions, not only in their operations, but also in their lending portfolios by 2050. In doing so, they join major other global banks outside of the United States that have made similar commitments. And now also major financial regulators in the EU and the US are focusing their attention on issues relating to climate change. Can you help us understand why climate change has become such an important issue for private banks to address? What's motivating banks? And what is it that makes climate change a financial risk or a financial opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break that down a bit. So you raise a number of issues that I think are important to unpack. The first thing is when you're thinking about a financial institution, a bank, and its balance sheet, the starting point is to think about risk. And essentially, particularly thinking about the last crisis we all lived through, making sure we accurately identify, isolate, and mitigate risk in banks is critical. So climate change has been identified as a potential near-term risk that we need to take account of. And note that I say near-term. Climate change isn't a risk that manifests itself in 20, 30, 40 years' time. It's a risk that's happening, those consequences are felt now. And that's particularly in the form of physical risk, looking at the impacts of drought, wildfire, flooding, changing climatic events that are happening now. So when we're thinking about risk in the context of a bank and stress testing a bank's balance sheet, the first protocol is to think about, what have you got on the loan book and how exposed is that to the near-term consequences of climate change? That's the first thing, right? It can have a material near-term impact on banks' profitability. Now let's think about the medium term. And the medium term is we think about, a transitioning energy mix. And this is this is something that, and it was reiterated last week by several global leaders, including President Biden, thinking about the changing energy composition, thinking about what the implications of the Paris Agreement are. So we know that we're trying to get to net zero by 2050, but that's a transition, right? That's not that there is an endpoint, but there's a transition pathway to get there. So what that transition pathway implies is essentially an evolving energy mix, and therefore an evolving asset mix on banks' balance sheet. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at, for example, the International Energy Agency's scenario analysis of what the energy composition will look like now in 2030 and 2050 and how we get there, we need to reflect on that as financial institutions and see how that's how our loan books fit with that exposure. One of the things we're concerned about clearly is stranded asset risk. You don't want to be holding the asset that doesn't have that is non-financeable as a bank. And again, that's exactly what happened in 2008. Banks held assets that became non-financeable. So we need to think about that in the context of a loan book and how that evolves. So stranded asset risk is probably the biggest medium-term risk that we're thinking about in terms of the loan book. And then the last thing that's worth mentioning from a risk perspective is stress testing, right? Stress testing on profitability and what it does in terms of our required, banks' required levels of capitalization and how that could change. So stress testing is maybe a little bit different to thinking about stranded asset risk. Stress testing says, okay, if we work on the premise that the global economy will look different in 10 years' time, and it could even look different in the next 3 or 4 years, we need to start stress testing portfolios to see how, for example, things like a changing carbon price could affect profitability. Right? What does that do to P&L? What does it do to the bottom line? And how much tail risk are we running if, for example, we start to see changing through either taxes or the regulatory landscape, changing prices of carbon in the economy. So stress testing of balance sheets and profitability is sort of the another near to medium term risk we're looking at. So all of that is the risk side of the equation, right? And that's why it's important to financial institutions. You also mentioned opportunities, Sarah, and that's sort of a key aspect as well, because when we're thinking about, I guess from the perspective of a transitioning economy, we also want to think of it in the context of, from a sector perspective and from a security from a company perspective, which sectors and companies are best positioned to benefit from that transition, which countries are best positioned to benefit from that transition, and to think about how our loan book could evolve accordingly. So all of this is in the context of a balance sheet, and the commitments that you alluded to specifically refer to banks' balance sheets. But banks also have a role to play in transitioning the economy in terms of the advisory side, the investment banking side, the sales and trading side. So thinking about how that broker-dealer relationship also becomes important as part of the transitioning economy is critical. So that isn't captured in any of the pledges that we made, but is equally important. So some of the conversations that my investment banking colleagues have at the moment with companies on the energy and utility side go, your business will look very different in 10 years' time. Here's what you need to sell, here's what you need to buy, here's how you need to reprofile your business in order to prepare for that. That doesn't appear anywhere on our balance sheet, but it's an equally important part of our business. So two separate sides of the equation, as well as thinking about the risk and the opportunity side of the balance sheet as well.
Great. I think that that's really helpful. And so I know that you aren't a public regulator, but I know that you've also obviously spent a lot of time working with government agencies. And one of the big debates in the United States is the role that the Fed ought to play or ought not to play in addressing climate change. And one of the big questions is whether climate change is a systemic risk. Is climate change, when you think about it from the perspective that you hold at Morgan Stanley, either with respect to balance sheets or in the asset management space, is climate risk something that you can diversify beyond? Like, are you able to simply change your asset mix, or is it something that you think is so pervasive in the economy that it's simply not possible to diversify and that we need to be thinking about it in a kind of systemic way, or regulators need to be thinking about it in a systemic way?
Yeah, so this is actually a a quite complicated question to unpack, because the simple answer is climate change is a systemic risk, and it's a global systemic risk. And this is where, when you start to get into some granularity here, you need to start thinking about what is the role of a financial institution, what is the role of an investor in managing and mitigating that risk. And here I want to be very candid. You need to look through the lens of what essentially what a fund or a portfolio says and what it actually does. So let me explain what I mean by that. It's very easy to create a low carbon, climate aligned portfolio. It's actually very easy. All you need to do is go underweight, industrials, energy and utilities, go overweight, tech, and hey presto, you have a low carbon portfolio that is in theory aligned to to the aims of the Paris Agreement, right? You've accomplished precisely nothing. All you've done is change your sector allocation. And the question that I ask myself is, what is the right approach here? Is the right approach to say those dirtier parts of the economy, the riskier parts of the global economy, let's just ignore those and hope they go away, and let's concentrate on the clean parts of the economy that make us feel good about ourselves and that optically look like we've achieved something? Or do we really need to engage with the more challenging aspects of industrials, energy and utilities and try and encourage meaningful change in terms of transitioning business models? There's no right answer here. Some clients that I speak to say, we just don't want to touch, heavy utilities that are involved in coal. We just want to avoid those altogether. And that's understandable, because if you are an existing coal utility, then there's a huge amount of risk associated. It's stranded asset risk, it's litigation risk, it's carbon price risk, all the things I talked about earlier. But at the same time, I would argue is if you are a responsible steward of capital, you also want to be thinking about the role you play in catalyzing change. And there's more impact you can have by working with those companies to try and improve their business models than simply focusing on the cleaner parts of the global economy. Similarly with countries, right? How much value is there really in building another wind farm in Scandinavia versus working in emerging markets to try and get more renewable energy onto the grid, or even natural gas onto the grid, by the way? I mean, the single most impactful thing you could do in the developing world is probably moving from kerosene onto natural gas. Kerosene is a very dirty, heavy fuel. It's only really used in the developing world. Moving all of that onto natural gas is probably the single most impactful thing you could do from a carbon perspective. So we need to think about those sorts of dynamics. So that's why, the short answer is yes, it's a systemic risk. But the more complicated answer is we have to think about what we're trying to accomplish. You asked me about regulators, the Fed, the ECB, and their role to play in this. I think the role of regulators and supervisors in particular have to play is to think about how risk is being managed in the system. Where does it lie? Is it accurately being measured, managed, and disclosed? That, I think, is the most useful thing a regulator can do. And also to turn their attention to their own balance sheet. And you mentioned the for those central banks that are themselves managing and mitigating climate risk becomes quite important. I see my internet connection's a bit dodgy. Can you still hear me okay? Should I switch to phone, or are you okay so far?
I was able to hear you. You had a little bit of a glitch for a moment. Yeah, perfect. There was a little bit of a blip. So let's keep going, and then we can always switch to phone if for audio if we need to. Oh, now I see that you're frozen. Do you want to switch to phone?
Sure, just shout or wave your hands if it's going.
Okay. Great. All right, now we have, Navindu is so prepared. He comes with a headset for the left ear and a headset for the right ear, and we are now switching headsets so that we have a clearer connection. This is someone who totally knows how to be prepared for a Zoom. We should all take lessons from this. Great, thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. So, so you mentioned the short-term risk as well as the near-term risk. And when you're speaking about the near-term risk, you're talking about the transition to a low or zero carbon economy. Obviously, one of the things that is in everyone's interest, the financial sector, as well as individuals and beyond, is that the transition be smooth and not sort of off a cliff between 2049 and 2050. So one of the key roles that the financial sector can play is not only to mitigate climate risk, but also to help finance and guide the transition to a low carbon economy or zero carbon economy in a smooth way. Do you have a sense or an estimate of how much it's going to cost to engage in this transition? And what are the biggest challenges in making that transition move forward smoothly? Oh, hang on. You are your phone may be on mute.
I'm now.
Okay, now you're
good. I think the internet connection's back, but again, shout if it goes wrong. No I'm gonna claim a pass on the estimate of the cost, meaning the multi-trillions that are involved. Okay. But talk about the granularity. The biggest challenge actually in persuading companies, governments to transition is usually most of what we're talking about here has a J curve to it, right? There's an upfront cost that takes time to pay back. Now, you look at the renewables industry as an example of this. The costs have compressed, and the break even of renewables versus fossil fuels has actually become, very comparable. The challenge with renewables is actually ensuring stability of energy supply across the grid. So it's a slightly different problem now. But the biggest challenge is actually persuading companies, governments that taking this cost and investing this capital where it's needed upfront today is actually something that's worthwhile, and that the consequence of it paying back over time. And here I think this is where it becomes quite critical for investors to actually highlight that we're going to give companies the benefit of making this investment. So what I would highlight.
Oh, Navindu, I think you need to switch back to your phone line. I think that
I'm back on the phone again because I think I froze. Apologies.
No problem. Go ahead.
I'll go with this and tell me if it gets annoying in terms of the mismatch, the mismatch between the two. The point I was making essentially in persuading companies to transition is the difference that investors can make at the moment is essentially to highlight that we're giving them the benefit of that, of making that investment. So becoming less short-termist in our approach. So the way we've approached our practice within MSIM is to highlight to companies that if they are investing CapEx or OpEx as part of a clearly articulated transition philosophy, that we're happy to support that with capital. We're happy to be patient as part of our investment to to help that transition, and we're looking through the short-term impacts that might have to profitability, thinking about the long-term benefits to the share price or to credit spreads. So that's how we think about catalyzing a transition through capital and persuading companies and governments to make those near-term investments that hopefully pay off in the longer term.
Great. So in your role at Morgan Stanley Asset Management, you've just talked about sort of the efforts that you can make to persuade, as well as your ability to invest capital with the kind of the benefit of the doubt, trading off a little bit perhaps on the short term in favor of the longer term benefit. What other tools do you have in your arsenal to promote a smooth transition at a financial institution like Morgan Stanley?
Yeah, there's a few things actually, a few levers we can actually pull here. So the first thing is so on the investment management side, we have an engagement practice. It's essentially a stewardship role that we perform where we've defined a framework. It doesn't just encompass climate change, by the way. We specified 4 priority themes that are institutionally important to us. So this is, it answers a very basic question, like what's important to us as Morgan Stanley Investment Management? What are our priorities? And our 4 priorities are decarbonization and climate change, pollution prevention and the circular economy, decent work and resilient jobs, and diverse and inclusive business. That's what's important to us. And what we look to try and do is essentially assess and evaluate the companies in which we invest according to that framework. It doesn't mean we won't invest if you're deficient on that framework. It does mean we're going to ask some quite challenging questions and to push you, if you want to continue to benefit from our capital, to try to improve. Okay, and similarly, where there are outperformers on that matrix, we are keen to try and support that outperformance, and that's a simple way of how we can we can generate alpha for our clients by highlighting and identifying those sorts of opportunities that hopefully help us capture outsized returns by using sustainability as a tool to push for better performance and riding that upside essentially. That's the first thing on the investment management side. On the banking side, what is a bank? Let's strip away the wood from the trees. A bank, very simply, is an intermediary of capital. So a bank's role is as a conduit from moving money from where it's from people who have it to people who need it. And a bank's role in that is essentially to advise, their clients on, I gave this example earlier, how they can improve, transform, evolve their business models to best benefit from the flow of capital. And that can mean essentially a role for the advisory side of the business, the investment banking side. It can mean a role for our capital markets colleagues in advising on things like, green bonds to sort of drive specific flows of capital to achieve specific solutions. It can also involve, by the way, our colleagues in sales and trading to help highlight to companies how they are benefiting or failing to benefit from perception in the marketplace. So, there is a spread opening up. There is a risk premium attached to being less sustainable, and that's something that's manifested in trading activity. So those are the sort of areas where I feel that both banks have a role and investment managers have a role as well in promoting a transition to a more sustainable economy.
Great, terrific. So you mentioned green bonds, and obviously you have been very involved in originating green bonds, including in sort of the first $1 billion green bond. Could you talk about the role that green bonds play? Maybe even give us some specific examples, if you're able to, of the ways in which green bonds are helping to finance a smooth transition to a low carbon economy.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started in green bonds, they were small, and this is going back 10 years. They were small instruments. They were primarily targeted towards a retail audience, and the projects invariably were focused around renewable energy, maybe some energy efficiency aspects to it as well, but it really was a way in which to promote clean energy, and they were sold to primarily Asian retail investors. What's happened since then in terms of the evolution of that market is, first we started work. You mentioned, at the multilateral development banks, they adopted that product in size, started issuing $1 billion plus transactions to really crowd in institutional capital, still very much focused around clean energy, but that's how the institutional market in this product got going. And then it started broadening it out into the corporate sphere as well. So corporates started issuing green bonds. Initially, these were corporates in the utility space, once again, still very much focused on renewable energy. But then the whole concept started expanding. And this is where it started to get really interesting, because companies started realizing that, sustainability and environmental considerations in their business models weren't just relevant to energy and utility companies. They were relevant to all sectors and all industries who needed to ask themselves the quite challenging question of how does both the environmental and social factors feature within my business model, and how can that be improved? How can I define a blueprint in order to make those improvements and then invite investors to support that blueprint with their capital? And so that started to become quite important for the market, because most recently we've seen companies look at how green bonds can support a reduction in their waste footprint, an improvement in their real estate portfolio to essentially roll out, energy efficient buildings, looking at circular economy and how, not just thinking about reducing waste, but also recycling and promoting the use of recycled content, whether that be, recycled metals to make batteries or to make cars, or recycled plastic used in packaging. And then there's also, separately to that, the quite interesting parallel growth of the social bond market. Now, social bonds originally were very small, but now, particularly post-pandemic, they are growing as a tool, and they really took off last year with companies and governments issuing social bonds, particularly as part of their response to the COVID pandemic. But also we've seen quite an interesting, more recent phenomenon where companies in particular have realized that all of us as consumers want to see how they are delivering something more to their business, to being more inclusive, thinking about how their products and services can be targeted to more vulnerable and more challenged segments of the population, how they are being more diverse in their business practices, in their hiring, in their encouragement of their employees. These are obviously good things to do from a moral perspective, but it's also good business. It's good business very simply because consumers are demanding it. Consumers are voting with their dollars and how they spend their money. And we've seen this through the pandemic. We've seen that the companies that, took care of their employees, that managed their supply chains well, that pivoted from making widgets to making personal protective equipment that looked after customers that maybe had difficulty paying their bills. All those sorts of things led to tremendous brand value, consumer engagement, and really, as you move through the recovery phase of the economy that we hope we're moving into soon, those are the companies that are going to succeed. So it's good business as well as doing good. That's sort of how we think about sort of evolving social bond market as well.
Great. So a few folks have started sending questions in the chat, and I'm going to break my original plan because one of them is very relevant to the point that Navindu just raised. So instead of waiting to the end, where appropriate, I'll work them in. So to your point, earlier you talked about capital allocation being a driver of change, but just now you're talking about social bonds being good business. Do you see a trade-off between returns for allocators and investments in more sustainable opportunities?
Yeah. So here I just want to be completely honest. It depends on the time frame that you're looking at. Okay, so we talked about risk earlier on. We talked about risk and opportunity. Some of the more challenged sectors, industries within sustainability, they might trade cheap, right? And that's a simple fact. They trade cheap because there's more sustainability risk associated with it. So by investing in some of those sectors, you can think about the tobacco sector as an example. There may be more carry that you could pick up. There may be from a financial perspective that might lead to some short-term returns. But then we also have to think about not just return in absolute terms, but also risk-adjusted returns and tail risk and what that could imply. So those sectors trade cheap for a reason, because there is some risk associated with it that could manifest itself quite significantly and quite suddenly and quite materially. So we have to think about that when we're allocating capital. So I would say that, there potentially, and we want to be very candid about this, there is potentially a compromise in near-term carry, because some of these sectors do trade cheap, but they trade cheap for a reason. You have to think about not just the return, but the risk-adjusted return of the investments you're making. It also depends how you implement a sustainable investing strategy. There's a multitude of different ways of doing this. And one way in which you can do this is by focusing on specific sectors to the exclusion of others. Well, that narrows your investable universe, and that obviously creates a sector tilt. Again, that has an investment implication. Another way of doing this is tilt towards stronger sustainability performers, exclude the weaker ones. You could do that on a sector-by-sector basis, but there you narrow your investable universe. So there is an opportunity cost. It might be a manageable opportunity cost, but again, be very candid. You have to be transparent about what you give up and what you gain. So it's a long answer to what sounds like a simple question, but it depends how you implement the strategy, and it depends what you're measuring, whether you're measuring carry, whether you're measuring near-term returns, whether you're thinking about Sharpe ratio and risk-adjusted returns in terms of what you're trying to achieve with an investment portfolio.
Great, terrific. So going back for a moment to the kind of broader question of the investments that a firm can make, in its asset management role, the advice that you can give to your clients. How do you measure impact? How do you know if the choice that you've made has actually been a good one along the dimension of promoting the transition to a clean economy, reducing climate risk? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
So in some ways, climate is one of the easier ones to assess impact, because there's some quite clear metrics you can use. So the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure has has been one of the strongest proponents of metrics here, and their favored metric, particularly when it comes to companies, is looking at carbon intensity. Carbon intensity, for people that don't know, essentially looks at for any given company their carbon emissions measured as a proportion of sales. You look at tons of CO2 emitted per $1 million of sales. It's a neat metric because essentially it allows you to compare companies of different sizes, and every single company, regardless of what sector you're in, will, as long as they have revenue, you can come up with a carbon intensity metric. There is, however, a problem with it, because there is one challenge that you need to consider, which is essentially, it doesn't really come into what you gain by using that metric is also potentially an informational loss, because it's very much sensitive to the denominator, right? So changing metrics around sales, if there's if in 1 year your sales, in particular could have happened last year with the pandemic, if your sales drop significantly, suddenly your carbon intensity as a proportion of sales could increase. But has anything materially changed with the company in terms of its footprint? So we look at other metrics as well. We look at things like carbon emissions, the proportion of capitalization. We look at energy mix and how that's evolving. So we'll look at, for example, for a utility company, we'll think about what proportion of their energies is produced from renewables versus nuclear versus coal, natural gas. Think about their entire stack of energy mix. We'll also look at targets and commitments. This is also one way of measuring not necessarily impact, but ambition, right? To have companies make pledges towards net zero alignment or carbon transition. So in some ways on the climate side, particularly I would say climate mitigation, we have a whole series of quite useful metrics we could use. But climate mitigation isn't the only thing we need to be thinking about. We also have to think about climate adaptation. And here, thinking about climate resiliency, preparedness, I talked about physical risk earlier, your exposure and your potential, mitigants to flood, wildfire, drought, all those sorts of things. That's much harder. It's much harder to think about, to measure and empirically assess impact when it comes to climate adaptation and resiliency. And then when we get into the social sphere, it's incrementally and exponentially harder, because in the social side, you don't really see the results and the impacts till a little bit further down the track. So monitoring outcomes becomes quite challenging, and it's an evolving space in terms of how we're thinking about social impact and social outcomes, and how capital can best be invested to achieve those sorts of meaningful change when it comes to social transition as well.
Great. And how important, one of the issues that's at play right now in the United States is the extent to which companies need to disclose their climate risks. So the SEC in 2010 issued guidance for companies on the disclosure of material risks, saying this does include climate risk, but there's frankly been a fair amount of confusion, a lot of boilerplate language in these public mandatory disclosures, and now the Biden administration is kind of reconsidering the possibility of issuing more specific directives on this front. But of course, there's also a plethora of private disclosure standards, everything from you mentioned the Task Force on Climate Disclosures, the TCFD, as well as the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They're sort of an alphabet soup. How important is it to you that these companies are engaging in disclosures that are comparable, as opposed to simply putting out sustainability reports according to potentially different metrics? In other words, would it be helpful to you in your role to have more sort of clear mandatory rules?
Yeah. So, and I see one of the questions that came in was also about PCAF, and Morgan
Yes.
Stanley was one of the first banks to sign up to PCAF. So the short answer is yes. Comparability is the biggest challenge we have. And again, let's strip away the wood from the trees here. All these glossy, well, I think these days PDF sustainability reports, no one wants to print these things, but all these glossy sustainability reports, a lot of them are marketing documents of limited utility. Comparability is the biggest challenge we have, and actually having a standardized framework of reporting and information that we can use to actually come to informed decisions on the investment side is critical. So I think, I mean, you made an interesting point with the political aspirations in the US. I think irrespective of that, we obviously have a significant wave of regulation that's being implemented in Europe at the moment with the European Union Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. Even if we don't have a convergence of regulation, I still think we're going to end up with a convergence of approach for the very simple reason that we have a global marketplace. We have a global economy. US corporates are issuing in the European market and vice versa. European corporates are issuing in the US market. So, companies are selling themselves internationally. And if there is an informational disparity between what I as an investor am getting from a European company versus a US company, I have to believe that there will be a convergence there. Because, let's take a sector, let's take the auto sector, under an enormous amount of pressure in Europe to help, promote an electrification agenda, which comes with it, what comes with that is, an enormous amount of pressure to disclose in a consistent fashion the metrics and the targets that they're putting in place. And if the European auto sector is doing that, I have to believe that the US auto sector, the Asian auto sector will do likewise, because we have the luxury of choice of being able to invest in any of those. So irrespective of what happens in terms of domestic regulation, I think I'm cautiously optimistic some of, whether it's, a PCAF methodology or other will become increasingly adopted. So we have, particularly amongst larger companies, we have a more standardized assessment framework that we're using the same information, because it's in companies' interests as well to make sure that we're making those investment decisions with full information available to us.
Great, terrific, and you mentioned PCAF a couple of times, and it is mentioned in the chat. So for those of you who do not know, PCAF stands for the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, which is the sort of association standard that major banks are using, at least for one purpose, is to account for the carbon footprint of their lending portfolios, although there may be other ways in which firms use that. So to follow up on the question that we received from the chat, do you think that the new Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials framework should be a regulatory mandate? Is it enough that it's an industry norm based on what you've said?
I'm always somewhat cautious about a regulatory mandate because it's hard, right? And I think at this point, I mean, Morgan Stanley signed up to PCAF. We're working through some of the implications. Essentially, right? If I think about, just to maybe sort of simplify things a little bit, we signed up for three things. We signed up for TCFD, PCAF, and the Net Zero Banking Alliance. So TCFD specifies the metrics, essentially. PCAF is the methodology, right? The calculations and the approach. And Net Zero Banking Alliance is the trajectory and the ultimate endpoint. So metrics, methodology, trajectory, and endpoint. And the methodology part is not straightforward. You have to have resources and capabilities to implement it. The problem with making that mandatory from a regulatory perspective is different companies are in different stages of their evolution. If a small company has to suddenly, implement a PCAF methodology, they might not have the resources to do that yet. Ultimately, medium term, I think that's a great ambition, but there may be a phase-in path to get there. And the reason we were so keen as an institution to be early adopters here is to work on helping refining that framework and working through some of those implications on the methodology to try and make it user friendly and make it, essentially widely adopted and available for all. So hopefully become something that's easy to use on a voluntary basis. If it is, then the regulatory requirement sort of falls away. If it essentially becomes, as user friendly as possible.
Great, terrific. So we've been speaking a lot about obviously the role of banks and financial regulators, but there are other financial institutions that are not banks that operate in this space that have a role to play in addressing climate change and financing the transition to a low carbon economy. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the key institutions and what role they can and should play. For example, we have what are often called the universal owners like Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock that own a very large portion of the market and therefore may take a more long-term perspective with respect to climate change. I'm curious to know how you think about some of the other important players in the financial sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's break it down a little bit. So universal owners, first of all, clearly, a universal owner can't afford not to be present in certain segments of the market. So I think they have a critical role to play in terms of their voice and accountability. And that's the crucial element for me. It's one thing, to be vocal, and a number of those universal owners are extremely vocal. But then part and parcel of that is the accountability side. So how are they actually using their position as a universal owner to encourage meaningful change? And for that, that's a combination of stewardship and thinking about their engagement practices, their voting practices, and how they can actually, essentially facilitate a parallel shift towards a more sustainable economy. That's my view on universal owners. When you're thinking about, other agents in the financial sphere, here I want to highlight the role of insurance companies. So climate risk is clearly something that is, and sustainability risk more generally is something that is a key consideration for insurance companies. But insurance companies also have a role, not just in terms of helping to, think about that risk and the implications of it, but also in their providing of underwriting services to help manage that risk and facilitate the green economy. So, for example, every single renewables development usually takes out insurance to cover, essentially as a contingency plan through the phase of development. So thinking about the role of insurance companies actually facilitating that green transition, not just from a risk management perspective, but from a facilitation perspective. The third group that I want to talk about is essentially where I started my career and where we began some of this conversation thinking about large international finance institutions, multilateral development banks, the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, organizations that have several $1 billion worth of investments to make in government and the private sector every year. What role do they play in the transition to the green economy at the sort of the supranational level? And I think this becomes critically important as part of the overall agenda. So it's interesting to me that a number of those organizations, you see this in Europe as part of the EU's recovery plan, 30% of what the EU is going to issue is going to be in green bonds. Going forward, several of these multilateral development banks are making commitments around the proportion of their balance sheet that we focused on the green economy. So they have a pivotal role in essentially in directing capital at scale towards green solutions. So those are maybe three of the. Happy to answer any other stakeholders you like to mention, but those are the three of the key ones that I think are critical as part of the energy transition in particular that have a role to play.
Terrific. Okay, I want to talk about the topic of greenwashing because I think it's extremely important. One of the key questions that arises in any area, not just sustainable finance, but sustainable marketing, sustainable, strategy, is the question of how to determine whether the product or the investment is actually green, right? And green itself, like green versus brown, is such a general terminology that it is somewhat meaningless. So the EU has recently adopted a regulation that you alluded to or mentioned earlier called the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation to address the challenge of greenwashing, as well as the EU taxonomy on sustainable investments. I was wondering if you could help the audience sort of understand a little bit about the sort of this question of greenwashing, how to ensure that actions by banks actually are supporting the green and environmental and climate related goals, that they're genuine and that they're durable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to give you my potted guide on how to spot and avoid greenwashing. It essentially boils down to this: ignore all the marketing or the labeling and actually just look at materiality. Here's how I think about materiality. There's 4 layers to it. The first question I ask myself is the bad stuff, is the really bad stuff being avoided here? Is the other things that I consider from a sustainability perspective particularly negative being mitigated to a significant extent? And that could be sectoral, things like controversial weapons, tobacco, firearms, coal mining. If you consider those sectors to be very negative from a sustainability perspective, how are they being avoided, mitigated, reduced in a strategy? Also consider not just sectors, but also what are commonly referred to as global norms. So if there are violations of, labor's practices or human rights, issues, or really significant controversies from a governance perspective or from a supervisory perspective, how are those being taken into account of and being managed? Okay, so look at what you're being presented with and think about whether the bad stuff is being avoided. Then the next layer then is to think about, okay.
Oh, hang on. Wait, Navindu, you just switched to video. Hang on. I still can't hear you. 1 second. No, I still can't hear you.
I think
now
I'm
I can hear you. Yes,
you're
back.
Apologies.
You've returned.
Yeah.
No problem.
I think my phone just gave up on me, so apologies for that.
No problem.
We'll stick with this as long as we can.
Great.
The second aspect that I looked then is, okay, once you've got rid of the bad stuff, to what extent is this strategy, this policy, this framework prioritizing the good? So the better performers versus the weaker ones. So is there a tilt towards stronger sustainability performers? Is there a methodology for screening out the weaker ones? That doesn't mean, a company or being, bad for society, but maybe they aren't doing as good a job. If you look at a particular sector, some companies may be more advanced on a green transition or on a clean energy transition than others. So how is this strategy actually promoting and supporting the better performers versus the weaker performers? That's my second layer. My third layer is to think about the portfolio, the strategy, the company as a whole, and think about priority themes and how they are helping achieve them. Remember my thematic framework that I mentioned to you before? Decarbonization and climate change, pollution prevention and circular economy, decent work and resilient jobs, diverse and inclusive business. Simple themes that I try and hang my hat on, right? Is this company, is this portfolio, are they supporting and promoting and helping achieve any of those themes, right? Again, these are the things that are important to me institutionally. Decide what's important to you and whether what you're looking at is helping, essentially advance any of the themes that are important to you. Fourth thing is impact. How important is impact in your assessment framework, and how is that company or that fund or that strategy helping to deliver impact? Now, impact is different to a theme. Impact is, I could say climate change is an important theme to me, so I want to invest in, overall, I want to look for companies that are low carbon as a theme, right? Impact is, I want to find companies that are helping solve the climate change problem, right? I want to invest in a fund that is helping to solve the climate change problem. So the final layer that I look at is impact, and see whether I can see in a company or in a fund how they are delivering impact if they're claiming to do so, right? And metrics is a big part of that. So it's a simple methodology. It looks at, avoid the bad, lean into the good, think about a thematic, what thematically is important to me and whether I can see evidence of that, and whether there is a drive and a promotion of impact. And if you apply, that's my methodology. You can tweak that to your requirements. But if you apply a simple methodology like that, that's the way you strip away the narrative and actually get to materiality and avoid greenwashing.
Great, excellent, terrific. So, so the title of this event is not just how can finance solve the climate crisis, but it's can finance solve the climate and COVID crises. And so I want to bring in the pandemic for a moment, which is obviously still very severe globally. I'm interested to understand, how has COVID changed things for private financial institutions like Morgan Stanley, and whether you feel that you've learned any lessons that in responding to COVID that might affect how you would think about the role that a bank could play in responding to climate change.
Yeah, three things. First of all, the importance of resiliency in the system, and also therefore the importance of investing and supporting resiliency. So we've seen that, right, in terms of how we've had to adapt business models and ways in which we work, ways in which we live, to the pandemic, and having that resilience in the system to shocks, be those climatic shocks, hopefully there's another pandemic anytime soon, but any sort of essentially building in capacity to the system, so any sort of stress event, there is an ability to withstand it. And previously, it sounds something very simple, but previously the way financial and business models worked was, well, if something is a rare event, let's just plan to take the hit when it comes, because it isn't actually, investing the money today to plan for a 1 in 100 event isn't a good trade-off. That's changed, right? That the way in which we approach that has changed, because actually now we want to see, the whole concept of the black swan, event, or the gray rhino event even, means that we have to start thinking about how we plan for those events, because the impact could be more significant than anticipated, and therefore is worth investing in today. That's the first thing. Second thing is the changing role of, and I mentioned this earlier, of social factors in an investment thesis. So how companies are managing workforces, managing labor practices, supply chain practices, inclusivity, and it's not coincidental that clearly there's been a movement around Black Lives Matter, and also the social aspect of how companies are operating has come to the fore, right? And if we'd had this conversation a year ago, we'd probably been talking almost exclusively about climate, but now we're increasingly talking about social issues as well. So that has changed. Investing in social aspects has been I think people realize that there is an economic value to that as well. And let me give you an example. I talked earlier about how companies can benefit from a halo effect, right? Consumers like companies that have become increasingly more social. But there's more than that to it. Companies can also benefit from a productivity aspect here as well. So an example with Morgan Stanley. So right at the beginning of the pandemic, our CEO came out and guaranteed everyone's jobs, right? And said, look, the one thing you don't have to worry about in 2020 is losing your job because of COVID. And that was huge. That was huge because, first of all, that's a big cost, right? Carrying everyone through the last year has a financial cost because you've got to pay everyone. But it had a benefit that clearly, from the C-suite they had anticipated, which is taking that uncertainty, taking that mental stress off the table, means that the employees could focus on, first and foremost, their family, secondly, their own health, and then thirdly, clients and serving clients, and not worry about losing their jobs, which then created an enormous amount of stress and anxiety. And it worked, right? It meant that we had, from a business perspective, we were able to actually orient it towards, trying to do our jobs and trying to serve our clients, and that resulted in business success as well. So that's an example of how a realization that labor practices isn't something that's kind of humdrum. Oh yeah, I need to tick the box because I don't want people to go on strike. It benefits companies because of productivity and because of particularly as you move through the pandemic into the recovery, having a strongly motivated, secure, engaged workforce can help your company. So that's the second example of the increasing importance of social. And the third point is the interconnectedness of things, right? So, the near-term problem with the pandemic was and the near-term effects were clearly felt most immediately in terms of the health crisis that we've had. But you know what? Climate change plays a role in that. Biodiversity plays a role in that because shrinking ecosystems, the increasing interface between human populations and animal populations, the reduced buffer between that mixing can promote disease. Extended seasons as a result of climate change, where you have warmer, more humid conditions for longer parts of the year, that helped spread disease as well. So thinking about how those aspects of what we focus on as part of and what we value from an investment perspective around biodiversity, around deforestation, around pollution prevention and habitat degradation, all those things have a role to play, not just in preventing pandemics, but hopefully reducing what we talked about earlier, systemic risk. So a recognition of the interconnectedness of the sustainability system becomes quite important as part of our thinking as well.
Great. Well, so I have one final question for you, and I think then we're going to draw our evening and our event to a close, since I've had the opportunity to work in some of the questions from the chat. We have a lot of Wharton students on the line at various stages in their career. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If there are students who are interested in pursuing a career in sustainable finance, what advice would you give them?
The simple advice I'd give them is go for it. There are an enormous amount of opportunities and a growing number specifically in this area. What I do, running sustainable investing for Morgan Stanley Investment Management didn't exist even, a few years ago. And it is the fastest growing area, I think, within financial services and within companies. There are jobs that will exist in 5 years' time that don't even exist now. The real beauty about sustainability and where we are right now in this sustainable finance evolution is it used to be the preserve of the corporate social responsibility department, right? It was like a marketing thing. It was about, going to schools and painting fences. It's not about that anymore. It's about business strategy. Companies in the next 5 to 10 years will need sustainability professionals embedded as part of their strategy department to tell them how to reprofile their businesses and how to make strategic business decisions that incorporate sustainability. Investors will have to be thinking about how an increasing sustainability agenda from our clients, asset owners, is incorporated into our investment practice. And ultimately, the confluence of those three things, the asset owners, asset managers, and companies, will all need people that have passion, motivation, and knowledge to help implement a sustainability transition. So if you're interested in this as a career, if you're interested in implementing a personal passion for sustainability in your professional roles, there will be there are opportunities now that weren't there several years ago, and there'll be more going forward. It clearly is a direction of travel, and it's growing exponentially. So yeah, I think it's a really great time to be exploring this as a career option.
Wonderful. Well, if you could all please join me in virtually thanking Navindu for taking the time to speak with us this evening. Navindu, I've enjoyed our conversation so much, and
Likewise,
I look
thank you.
forward to having many more conversations with you in the future. So thank you again for joining us. It's really been a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure as well. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time today. Thank you all for staying on.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.